Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the first in our series of Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute webinars on IP responses to COVID-19. My name's Duncan Matthews. I'm the director of the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute. And together with my colleagues from Queen Mary and fellow colleagues from the London School of Economics in London, we are going to today be talking about some of the access problems related to the COVID-19 response, particularly in terms of the diagnostics, the vaccines and the treatments. And in particular, we're going to be focusing today on why the COVID-19 response is different from previous intellectual property interventions in the area of public health and access to medicines. Our moderator today is my colleague, Professor Uma Suthersanen, who is the Deputy Director of the Queen Mary Intellectual Property Research Institute. And I'll now hand over to Uma for the chairing of the event today.
Thank you, Duncan. And I join Duncan in saying welcome to everyone. As I've seen the list, we have about 300 participants from all over the world. And we are really happy to join you today. Now, let me just say some administrative details. Can everyone ensure that the mics are off? Your mics will be automatically turned on joining, but in case it's accidentally turned on, I ask everyone to switch it off. And this includes the speakers as well, unless you're speaking, of course. The second thing is we will have a Q&A session, and we encourage everyone to use the chat button and facility and type in the questions. I'll try and consolidate them to ask the panel as we go along. However, it will be useful as well as each speaker gives their presentation that you start thinking of the questions and we can stream them as we go along. So without further ado, I will reintroduce the first speaker, Professor Duncan Matthews, Director of QMIPRI, who will be talking about, I believe, the IP responses in the context of TRIPS flexibilities. Thank you, Duncan, and you have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Uma. Can you see my slides? No, okay. I shall just apply the share screen function. Wonderful. My main task in just about 10 minutes is to give you a very brief overview of why it is that the IP responses to the current COVID-19 pandemic are different to previous experiences that we've had. And I'm thinking in particular of what happened 20 years ago when in relation to the WTO TRIPS agreement, we saw IP responses to the HIV/AIDS pandemic. So essentially, the situation that we're in now is not a repeat of the TRIPS and access to medicines debate. What we have today are, in a sense, informed by the previous debate, two diametrically opposed arguments which take opposing positions. First, we have the position that companies should give up their IP and that the intellectual property needed to address the COVID-19 response should be treated as a public good. At the other end of the spectrum, we see the argument that actually the intellectual property rights themselves are not a barrier to access, and that without intellectual property rights, companies will not invest and innovate. So what I'm going to try and describe to you in the next few minutes is that within the setting of these two diametrically opposed viewpoints, What we have to understand is that, in a way, these are old arguments, and that the situation that we have today is that the COVID-19 response is not just a repeat play of the Access to Medicines campaign from 20 years ago. And as you will recall, at that time, the focus was on TRIPS flexibilities, particularly compulsory licensing and other flexibilities which could be used in favor of public health, as set out in the Doha Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health from 2001. Now, the public health imperatives of the COVID-19 response are somewhat different. We have an overriding health objective of test, treat, and prevent. And in order to do this, public health authorities are involved in the interface between intellectual property and public health in three respects. Firstly, in terms of diagnostic kits, that's to say the intellectual property on diagnostics which can check for antibodies for patients who have previously had symptoms of COVID-19, and also in terms of either molecular or antigen tests to test whether a patient currently has the virus within them. Secondly, there are issues relating to the repurposing of existing treatments to target a COVID-19 medical response. The two high-profile examples of this are, of course, remdesivir, a antiviral which was developed to treat Ebola and patented by Gilead, and also an older drug called Coletra, which was originally developed as an antiretroviral to treat HIV, and the patent is owned by AbbVie. So there is a whole issue about repurposing of treatments for patented medicines. Thirdly, the public health response to COVID-19 is marked out by the fact that there's unlikely to be one single vaccine response. There are going to be a number of vaccines. Who will manufacture the vaccines and who will get vaccinated? That's the crucial issue. So these three public health imperatives indicate that there are patents, there's regulatory data, there's know-how, trade secrets, designs, and all these factors come into play. So the initial public health responses that we've seen have certainly been in terms of expanding the scope of compulsory license legislation. We've seen this in Ecuador, in Chile, in Germany, and in other countries, putting in place special provisions to ensure that not only patents, but in many jurisdictions, all types of IP would fall within the scope of a general compulsory license. And also in countries like Germany, making it easier to grant a compulsory license through government agencies' devolved powers. And there have been instances where compulsory licenses have already been issued, and I'm thinking in particular of Israel, which issued a compulsory license on the antiretroviral Coletra, and subsequently the patent owner AbbVie agreed that it would set aside its patent rights in other jurisdictions also. But we've also seen, alongside compulsory licensing, an increased role for regulatory agencies, such as in the United States, through the FDA's new policy to expedite approval for diagnostics, and also for the Food and Drug Administration's emergency use authorization on remdesivir. The European Medicines Agency has taken similar action for remdesivir in relation to compassionate use recommendations. So the agencies are expediting approval of potential diagnostic and repurposed treatments. We've also seen globally a huge number of initiatives for vaccine development. Many of these are involving public-private partnerships. We've seen in the United Kingdom, in Oxford University, an agreement whereby Oxford University will retain ownership of the intellectual property on any resulting vaccine, in partnership with the pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca, which will be the lead agency in terms of having the license and manufacturing the potential vaccine. In the United Kingdom, we've seen an interesting debate where Oxford University's approach has been contrasted with Imperial College London. And at Imperial College, the approach which is publicly being taken is that Imperial will own the intellectual property, but it will adopt a social contract model, whereby instead of using one global pharmaceutical company, that the manufacturing and building up, scaling up of capacity will take place at a local level in recipient countries. So this is called a social contract model. But behind both of these initiatives, we have doubts and lack of transparency about what are the licensing terms. We think we know who owns the intellectual property, but what are the licensing terms going to be? Similarly, Gilead, the owner of the patent on remdesivir, has announced publicly that it will grant voluntary licenses to 127 countries via manufacturers of generic versions of the product based in India, Pakistan, and Egypt. However, the 127 countries where this low-cost product will be made available exclude many countries, including the whole of Latin America. So overall, there seems to be a lack of transparency in licensing agreements, which is perhaps unhelpful. We've also seen in the last month developments at the World Health Organization. At the annual World Health Assembly, a COVID response resolution was adopted unanimously, but within minutes, the United States disassociated it from any references to human rights and TRIPS flexibilities in that agreement. The US also expressed concerns about key features of the resolution, which referred to the World Health Organization technology pool. And that technology pool is interesting because it's a voluntary system whereby IP rights owners can pool their technologies in a COVID-19 response, not just for patents, but for all types of IP. A related issue relates to the offshoring of supply chains. That's to say the trend for offshoring of pharmaceutical manufacturing, particularly for active pharmaceutical ingredients, where manufacturing overseas is considered cheaper and easier, for example, due to environmental costs, particularly by American companies. And now, of course, during the pandemic, there is a big debate about bringing that manufacturing capacity, particularly for active pharmaceutical ingredients, back onshore, and therefore reducing risks associated with global supply chains. So the takeaway points from my sort of opening remarks today are that it's wonderful to see the new and innovative ways that private companies are working together in their COVID-19 response. But this response requires not only private companies to engage with these issues, it also involves public policy responses. Compulsory licensing is one element of this, as is the role of regulatory agencies, as is public-private partnerships. However, what we're seeing in the COVID-19 response is that this is not just an issue of TRIPS flexibilities and access to medicines. The lack of transparency in licensing agreements is leading to uncertainties, and this is likely to hinder public scrutiny and debate and consideration of whether the licensing agreements perhaps contain any restrictive practices, in which case competition laws should correctly come into play. We've also seen a big debate emerging in relation to supply chain issues, and I pose the question, should we now be considering a situation of enlightened interdependence between nations who import and export pharmaceuticals, or are we entering a new era of pharmaceutical nationalism where bringing manufacturing supply back within territories is going to be the norm? So in conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic raises complex issues and problems that require coordinated responses, And of course, IP policy is part of the bigger picture. And I'll end my talk there, because I know my colleagues are going to pick up on some of those complexities in their presentations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Duncan, for that very concise start to the whole debate. There are lots of issues here, but before, and I can see some questions already coming in, but before we go on to them, let me introduce you to Professor Ken Shadlen from the London School of Economics. And go ahead, Ken.
Thank you. Thanks, Uma. Thank you, Duncan, for inviting me to participate here. And it's incredible to see this global audience strolling through the list of participants. It's amazing seeing so many people from all over the world. My presentation is going to build somewhat on some of the things that Duncan was just talking about, particularly how we sort of have a new set of challenges, a new set of issues. What I really want to focus on is how IP and access issues might look different in a world where, I'll develop this more, in a world where reverse engineering is exceptionally difficult and fast and massive scaling up of production is the highest priority. So to motivate this or to move things along, I want to start with a quick overview of some of the access issues on the pharmaceutical side. And the key thing to start with is that there are no vaccines or treatments. We know that. There are no approved vaccines or treatments, but this is not a neglected disease area. There's a lot of research going on. This is not like antibiotics or neglected diseases with anemic pipelines. Everybody is working on this. There's lots of action. There's products that are in development, in clinical trials and preclinical trials. The key thing is the access issues. And I'm not going to repeat the points that Duncan made. I'll just say that I think a particular issue of relevance in this instance is that when we do get a vaccine or some treatment, but particularly a vaccine, we need massive and rapid scaling up of production in a way that I think the world has never seen before, at least not in my lifetime. Now, what I'm calling the prevailing access approach says that we should relax legal barriers, because if we relax some of the legal barriers, this is going to increase market entry and this is going to increase competition. And this seems fairly logical. Why should we rely on a single supplier and that single supplier's licensees when there are hundreds, literally hundreds of firms around the globe that we think can produce? We need lots of doses of whatever the medication is, so let more firms produce. And as we do that, we might learn a lot more. We might learn new and better approaches with new formulations, new combinations. We should get lower prices too. This is, I think, the lesson from HIV/AIDS. And we hear this a lot. This sort of the lessons here gets invoked a lot. And in some ways, this is the logic informing what I think is sort of the call for what's been called the people's vaccine. And it's also the logic informing the WHO's technology access pool. Here I just put a couple of quotes on the slide. One is from Oxfam and their call for the people's vaccine. If the goal is mass production of safe and effective vaccines, we need as many factories producing as fast as possible without the need to ask for permission from large pharmaceutical corporations. The quote that I put below from the president of Costa Rica and the director general of the WHO, I'm not going to read it out here. It's essentially, it's saying something very similar. Reduce the barriers to entry, more firms will get involved, and we'll sort of be able to scale up production. But what if legal barriers are not the big issue? So like if the main barriers are legal, intellectual property, then we focus on how to relieve the legal barriers. So we do things like compulsory licensing. If the main barriers are production related, however, then we might need to focus on technology transfer. And the point that I just want to make here sort of on the side is that the statements that I put on the previous slide, I think appear to be made in a world in which the problems of technology transfer don't exist. Now, a lot of times when we talk about technology transfer in the area of intellectual property, we're talking about sort of university industry licensing. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about sort of firm-to-firm technology transfer, where the proprietor or the originator, say, helps the partners to learn to do things better. Now, if we take a step back, you could think that technology transfer can occur in different ways. It can occur through imitation. I mean, I think the technology gets transferred to me just through imitation or reverse engineering, call it what you want, and it gets done through licensing. And the question to ask is, what if imitation at scale is difficult? What if massive production and rapid massive production is a high priority? And so it might be, this is my main it's a provocative point, but I want to lay it out there. It might be that for medical products that are difficult to replicate, so the barriers are less legal than technological, and where we care a lot about scaling up in a very short period of time, then it's not obvious that openness and competition among multiple suppliers, which are the effects of relaxing IP, it's not obvious that these are most desirable. We may prefer to let the patent holder organize the network of licensees and sub-licensees and manage the global supply chain, like a giant vertically integrated firm. Let me go quickly by analogy. So General Motors had an initiative they started, I think it was in March, to manufacture a sophisticated version of a ventilator designed and produced by another American firm. GM flew engineers to Washington to learn the production process. They took a zillion and one pictures, a zillion and one videos, all with the permission of the firm, the proprietor firm. A few dozen engineers from that firm in the state of Washington essentially left their company and went on loan, as far as I know, are still on loan to General Motors. When a non-originator generic firm wants to produce drugs, they don't fly scientists and engineers to the originator's facilities to do this. They don't need to, because they can reverse engineer and scale up production on their own. This is technology transferring occurring via imitation, not via partnership, not via licensing. But what if ventilators were like drugs? In the ventilator example, General Motors could have done it on its own. They've got brilliant engineers. They could have figured out how to reverse engineer this sophisticated ventilator, but they would have been more prone to error, and it would have taken a longer time. But in normal times, we might have, that may not bother us. What if drugs and vaccine, what if drugs were like ventilators in times of a pandemic, when the need for scaling up of production very quickly is a higher priority? Then reducing IP to enable imitation may not be the key. We might need originators actively working with the producers to share the knowledge, the technology, and expertise. This simple 2x2 way of looking at it has on one axis difficulty of replication at scale and importance of speed, just simply lower and higher on each. And the right column, the one that I put in gray, is drugs are like ventilators. And then the bottom right cell is essentially drugs are like ventilators in times of pandemic. It might be that the normal approach to access is through competition and openness works in most situations, but it might be that the optimal way of doing it in this special situation, in what I'm calling the bottom right corner, when drugs are like ventilators in a time of pandemic, is different. Now, very quickly, because I'm running out of time here, I want to make a qualification here, just to be clear. The originator R&D-based pharmaceutical industry, they say this all of the time, right? This is what they would say about all of their products, regardless. That hierarchy and licensing, not openness and competition, is the way that we should be scaling up. And of course they're going to say that because it suits their interest to see relaxing intellectual property as counterproductive. But just because someone says something all the time doesn't mean they're wrong all the time, or to put it differently, maybe a broken clock can be right some of the time. Under specific conditions, I think this makes sense. But I just want to be clear about the qualification, or where the boundaries are of what I'm trying to put forward here, is outside of these specific conditions, outside of the southeast cell on this chart, I still think that openness and competition are the keys, or are keys for expanding access. So what's the takeaway from this? The takeaway from this is not to sit back and do nothing. The takeaway is not to trust us, let the pharmaceutical firms do what they will with their intellectual property, knowing that they'll do best. We want to encourage more technology sharing and licensing. So as Duncan says, we want to encourage more transparency in the licensing. We want to attach strings to this. We want benchmark of prices via health technology assessments. And we want governments to think about how to get these firms to think about global supply, So not just producing enough drugs for the UK or for Europe or the US, but how to produce enough drugs globally. We want to sharpen the tools to intervene just in case, which is what Duncan referred to about sort of measures countries are taking to sharpen their compulsory licensing tool or to prepare to use competition law if necessary. But it might be that these interventions, if these interventions are likely to basically make scaling up and production more difficult, there's another way we might want to think about this. And I think of this as a temporal approach. And I see I have 1 minute left, I'm just about to wrap up. A temporal approach, and I'll come back to this in Q&A if people like, which is essentially, if the company doesn't license and price and produce responsibly now, you sock it to them later. And think about it sort of, you can think about this sort of the way that the priority review vouchers in the US work. And what you're trying to do in the priority review vouchers is say to the company, if you do the right thing now, say innovate for a neglected disease, you'll make higher than expected profits on a later drug. And what I'm suggesting here, why I'm calling it the priority review voucher inverted, is that you're saying, if you don't do the right thing now, license widely and responsibly to generate sufficient supply, you're going to make lower than expected profits on the later drug. So make the companies know that they might be, that sort of you're looking at this in a temporal dimension. And so that's really where I want to end. I mean, the logic of patents, I think, is about incentives for innovation and mechanisms for technology transfer. In pharmaceuticals, we usually just focus on one for the reasons that I said before, that technology tends to be transferred very easily via imitation. So unless we're talking about university industry things, we don't care about licenses. But when the challenges are massive and rapid scaling up of complex, hard to replicate products, then I think we need to think more carefully about firm-to-firm international technology transfer. I like to think about this as getting beyond sort of the small molecule, normal times narrative. And I would just say by my final word is that these aren't brand new issues. I'm obviously not the first person to think about this. Technology transfer is in the TRIPS agreement in Article 7. Technology transfer was one of the 4 elements of the WHO's global strategy and plan of action from about a decade ago. So we've been thinking about technology transfer for a long time, but I don't think it's sufficiently been integrated into our analysis. And I think that the current situation really calls for new ways of thinking about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. That was fascinating. Now, I've had some questions coming through, and perhaps we take some of them rather than waiting right to the end, because most likely they are addressed at Duncan and Ken. First of all, a question as to the fact that the United States has disassociated itself from the WHO. Will this affect companies from the voluntary IP pool? Will it affect on US companies? What's the result? Duncan, do you want to address that?
Yeah, thank you, Uma. I saw that question come in from Professor David Vaver.
Yeah.
The answer is that, of course, it's a voluntary pool. So the US companies will not be excluded from the possibility to participate in the pool. And in addition, just to clarify, since I didn't have time during the presentation, what the US is objecting to is the using of a technology pool for any future emerging IP rights. So any existing pooled IP, the United States is not objecting to that in terms of the World Health Assembly resolution. But the short answer is to the question that, of course, it doesn't prevent American companies from participating voluntarily in the WHO technology pool.
Great. Someone else has also asked about whether the various international investment laws or FDI policies will hinder transnational technology transfer. I guess that's to both of you, really.
I might leave that to Ken.
Ken, say that again. I missed the question. I didn't see it in the chat.
Whether or not, in your view, because you were talking about whether or not it involves a legal solution or perhaps it's just a pure technology solution in your talk, in which case there is a question as to whether we should be also looking at the various FDI instruments and international investment instruments, and whether that's going to hinder the entire technology transfer process?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a really good answer to that. I mean, I certainly think we need to look at the way any set of international regulations might impede the ability to, if there are international, for example, if there are rules in international investment treaties, particularly bilateral investment treaties that might affect that, then we need to keep an eye on that. Yes.
Yeah. I have another question, and this is specifically to Ken, about what about the most disadvantaged countries or communities? What happens when the big pharma doesn't want to enter these markets, and then what happens?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and that's what I was trying to get to with my sort of second to last slide about what I was calling the priority review voucher inverted, and that is that if you make clear to the pharma firms that if they don't do this now, they're going to be paying a big price down the line.
How are you going to do that?
Well, you could basically make a statement that says, like, you know, we're sharpening our compulsory licensing tools, and we will use these when you come back the next time. You better watch out. I mean, and the point is that I don't. These aren't going to be blockbuster drugs. The next drugs might be blockbuster drugs, and so I think that in this, my point is that I think that to tell somebody, you better do the right thing on a drug where you're not going to make that much money anyway, or else you're going to not make money on the drug where you expect it to be a blockbuster, could be an effective way of sort of eliciting the right kind of behavior.
Yeah, this goes into another question, again, addressed at you, Ken, as to what regulators can do. So as you said, issue a statement. This particular question says, can regulators or the legislature do anything other than trusting? Should we put frown obligations, use competition law as a solution? I think you're saying use everything in your arsenal.
So I'm actually not saying, I'm a little bit hesitant to say using everything in your arsenal, because there actually is a part of me that thinks that using some of those things in your arsenal now might actually be counterproductive. If you actually take the argument to its logical conclusion, which is that you're going to get more faster and rapid scaling up if you just let the firm stay in control. My example of the giant vertically integrated firm. Then you would say that using all these instruments in your arsenal now might actually be problematic. What I'm saying is you want to have all these instruments in your arsenal and make it clear to that firm that if they don't do the right thing now, they're going to pay a big price later when it's going to matter to them a lot more.
Sure. Okay. There are some more questions. I'll come back to it. Just to get it moving along as time's running, can I introduce our next speaker, Professor Peter Drahos, who is currently at the European University Institute, and Peter also holds positions at ANU and Queen Mary. And I think, Peter, you're going to do a specific case study on Tamiflu. Over to you.
Thank you, Uma. So, good evening, everybody. I'm in Australia at the moment. I thought what I would do is to talk about an actual case study and draw some reflections on the themes that both Ken and Duncan have articulated, and in particular the theme of public good, which we've heard a lot about, as well as the rapid scaling of manufacture, which is an incredibly important issue that Ken raised, as well as some of the vices and virtues of data secrecy versus open science. So quickly, by way of background, the avian influenza virus H5N1 was first identified in the late 1990s in various bird populations. It spread rapidly from country to country in terms of bird populations. It jumped. And then it jumped from bird populations to people. And then the third precondition for a pandemic, and what the WHO was very worried about, was the possibility of easy transmissibility from person to person. Now, there was no vaccine at that point, but what we did have was a new class of antiviral medicines, principally oseltamivir and zanamivir. Oseltamivir was owned by Roche under license from Gilead, and Zanamivir was under license from an Australian biotech company, Biota. Okay, so this case study is interesting because it speaks to these three issues that I'm about to talk about. So first of all, we've heard a lot about the desirability of any treatment, whether it's antiviral or a vaccine, to be provided as a global public good. Now, once the WHO essentially backed a global stockpiling strategy based on primarily oseltamivir, there was huge global demand from all countries for oseltamivir. The brand name was Tamiflu, but I'll stick with the chemical name. So there was this huge demand for oseltamivir. So countries had a clear choice. In a sense, they could have taken the stepping stones to self-interest, or they could have cooperated on the provision of a global public good. What do I mean by cooperating on the provision of a global public good? Well, one can think of pandemics essentially as a kind of network externality problem, where if you join the network of vaccination or you join the network of treatment, you are in a sense lowering the risk of transmission. So it's a kind of negative public good, as it were. Now, every network has weak links. So one can think of it in terms of a firefighting analogy. When a fire breaks out, you generally send your firefighters to the source of the fire in the hope of containing it, because once it spreads, as we saw in Australia over summer, it's very hard to do anything. So based on this firefighting analogy and the idea of network externalities, it would have been rational for the world to have sent the scarce supplies of oseltamivir to the countries where the risk was the highest. And those countries were in Southeast Asia: China, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, where we had these outbreaks. And that would have been rational from a global public point of view, because they were the weak links in the chain. It's where you had the best chance of containing the outbreaks. However, that didn't happen. What actually happened was every country chose the stepping stones to self-interest. So the United States put tremendous pressure on Roche to create extra manufacturing facilities in the United States, making it perfectly clear to Roche that the United States wanted to be self-sufficient. Australia essentially tried to outbid as many countries as it possibly could. In a study that I did with some colleagues, what we were able to show was that the countries with the highest stockpiles were the lowest risk countries, and the countries with the highest risk simply weren't able to afford the prices being charged by Roche. Now, that obviously is an undesirable outcome in terms of global public goods. Now, my claim isn't that this will happen again. I'm simply pointing to what past experience, what past state practice in a particular case revealed about states. And I think we should ask ourselves, what will happen when treatments actually become available? At the moment, we are all basking in the sort of warm glow, as it were, of public good talk, but then talk is cheap. So that's really the first point. The second point relates to this very important problem that Ken raised of scaling, of getting to global scale, because there are many impediments there. Now, when countries began rushing to acquire oseltamivir, Roche was essentially unable to supply. There was actually a 2-year waiting list. Now, Roche actually wanted to coordinate supply. It wanted, as it were, to take over the supply of oseltamivir, and it assured countries that if they were just patient, everything would be okay. It also actually was very difficult about revealing what the manufacturing process was for oseltamivir, and indeed made it difficult for other companies to discover what the manufacturing process was. There were a whole host of other issues. It wasn't just Roche's reticence, of course. There were also problems with the intermediate ingredient, shiminic acid, which was very important as in the production of oseltamivir. And here, one of the problems was that one got the acid from anise star anise rather, and the issue there was there were limited supplies of that. There were some fermentation options, but again, there were issues around those. Cutting a long story short, it took almost 4 years before Roche was able to supply adequate amounts of oseltamivir. So I think here this particular case study shows that trusting one company, as it were, to organise supply has particular problems. And this leads into my third point, the virtues of data secrecy versus open science. As more and more scientists began to investigate, for example, the synthetic pathways to oseltamivir, it was discovered, for example, by Elias Corey at Harvard University, a Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, that there were in fact shorter pathways to a synthesis of oseltamivir that did not depend on access to star anise and shiminic acid. And in fact, more generally, there was competition in a sense that showed that we could get to the manufacture of oseltamivir faster and cheaper than Roche's production methods actually would have us believe. And this really leads on to my final point, which is that oseltamivir ultimately proved in a Cochrane review study not to deliver the efficacy that Roche claimed. There's a very good 2014 Cochrane review study of oseltamivir, which was done by independent scientists. And that independent open science ultimately showed that oseltamivir was not worth the investment. In fact, one of the Cochrane review investigators said it was really not much better than aspirin. And so the billions of dollars that were spent in investing in the stockpiling of oseltamivir proved, in a sense, to be a waste of public health money. So one of the lessons I extract from that is that independent review of both what the companies claim that something is doing, as well as what the regulators claim, is going to be vital. So I think one of the very, very important lessons here is that independent review of both what the regulators conclude as well as what the companies claim is going to be vital here, because the regulators and the companies are working hand in glove at the moment, and there's a kind of collaborative hopefulness that something will happen fast. But in a way, the entire vaccine and medical treatment procedure is on trial here. So we really need to get this right. So open science, and this is my final claim, is really critical here, and data secrecy is really our enemy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter, for that. Absolutely on time as well. There are a few more questions, but let me ask our final speaker to talk first, and then I will consolidate all the different questions. And so our final speaker is Professor David Musker from Queen Mary, and David will be discussing a topic that has actually been coming onto several webinars: crown use. I've never actually gone for any seminar on crown use, and suddenly this is the fourth talk, the best, of course. But what about crown use in the United Kingdom? David.
Thanks, Uma. So I'm going to be talking about crown use, which gives us a perspective on a developed world solution to an issue which is usually discussed in context of the developing world. A bit of due diligence here. When I started working in IP in 1986, my first job was working in-house in government, handling incoming crown use claims against the government. So I have a little bit of experience of crown use, albeit several decades out of date in all probability. Anyway, let me see whether I can share my screen and kick off. Can anybody see my screen? Good, okay. So what is crown use? Very briefly, it's the right of the UK and the devolved governments to use patents and also registered and unregistered designs, and to authorise other people to use them for the services of the Crown. So it's not only the government that can use, the government can authorise agents, contractors, suppliers to use. It's often discussed in the same breath as compulsory licenses, but a Crown use isn't a compulsory license. To analogize, you buy a house, it's got a beautiful drive and a beautiful garden, and then local government a couple of years later decides that it's going to build a footpath through your beautiful drive and your beautiful garden. That's a compulsory licensing equivalent. You had property rights, government has decided to take them away, and after some kind of process, if they're successful, they can do that. Crown use is more like buying a house from the previous owner who tells you that they've reserved their right of access over your drive. There's a right of way, they're going to keep their right of way for themselves or their contractors. You take out intellectual property rights subject to the Crown's overriding interests. It's a grant subject to an interest. And when you look at how Crown use and compulsory licensing are applied, that analogy reflects, because you haven't got a compulsory license until the license is granted. That's a process that takes time, procedure and cost. And in the two compulsory licensing cases I've been involved in, those things have been pretty daunting. It's a risk, and if you're a new entrant, if you're a generics manufacturer or a competitor, to come into a field, you have to make an investment with no necessary expectation that you're going to succeed. Crown use isn't like that. The Crown says we're going to use your patent, authorises a competitor to do so, and that's that. The terms are settled afterwards, no injunctive relief is available. It's not a wrong in any sense, it's a precondition. So that's Crown use. Crown use is subject to compensation. It's not a free ride for the Crown, and if that's not agreed, then that can be determined by the courts. And there are two different Crown use regimes: the normal Crown use regime under sections 55 to 56, and then the emergency regime under section 59, which gives quite extraordinarily wide powers to the Crown. So I'm just going to skip through these slides, but briefly, the theory in the 18th and 19th centuries was the Crown could not infringe the rights it had granted itself. The statute of monopolies had a reservation that patents shouldn't be mischievous to the state by raising prices of commodities or hurt of trade. And that remained the case until 1883, when the Gladstone Liberal government introduced Crown use It was a gain for the Crown in some ways because it enabled them to authorise other people to do stuff for them, but it had the corollary that the Crown would pay compensation. And that's the regime we've had since 1883. What I was involved in was Crown use for defence, but in 1961, the Conservative government used Crown use to buy 5 drugs. I guess they're all antibiotics, tetracycline and oxytetracycline certainly are. So the Crown bought those from generic suppliers in Italy through a UK supplier. In Italy at the time, drug patents weren't possible, so there was a big generic industry for these things, and the Crown bought them. And Pfizer challenged the Crown's right to do that, and the challenge went to the House of Lords in a case called Pfizer and Ministry of Health. In Pfizer, the majority held that essentially, if an activity is the responsibility of a minister under a statute, then it's Crown use. So if the government has a responsibility through a minister to do something, the execution of that thing, Crown use can be invoked to prevent patents standing in the way. Looks like from the majority judgment as if the organisational structure may be important here. So Pfizer and Ministry of Health was concerned with supplies in hospitals and to outpatients from hospitals, but there were some suggestions that that would not have applied to sales through GPs and pharmacies, even though that was also part of the national health system at the time. That was all obiter dicta because it wasn't in contention between the parties. Well, 66, the year after Pfizer and Ministry of Health, the Wilson Labour government came in and ceased to use Crown use for medicines, but they passed an amendment to the Crown use provisions enabling the extension of Crown use to supply through GPs and pharmacists, so that essentially the whole of the National Health Service was at that point covered by the Crown use provisions. And in the course of that, in Parliament, the minister quoted the price of tetracycline at £45 a thousand tablets before the Crown use provisions were invoked, down to £4 to £5 after the Crown use provisions were invoked. So seemingly Pfizer were on a 900% margin on tetracycline, and that was cut into by generic procurement. 1973, the Banks Committee looked at the complaints of the pharmaceutical industry, but decided to keep Crown use. At the same time, they abolished our previous compulsory licensing regime for pharmaceuticals. And the Banks report talks about the need to balance the price of drugs with the need to stimulate innovation, the usual compromise, and refers to using Crown use as a final sanction on a selective basis, so that only those manufacturers who exploited their patents in an unreasonable fashion would stand at risk. Now, they didn't recommend including anything to that effect in the Crown use provisions, and we don't have anything like that in our Crown use provisions, but that was the Banks Committee's reasoning for retaining Crown use. Since then, I'll skip over most of this, but in '88, in a case to do with equipment for pulverizing gallstones, one of our area health authorities was held to be acting under Crown use as a government department. And then most recently in 2020, I think 2 days before we went into lockdown, in a case called eValve, again an equipment case, Judge Burse refers to invoking Crown use in the case of a novel pandemic disease. So Crown use is in no sense a spent provision in relation to the medical sector, even though it is predominantly used in the UK for defence. Recent example, in 2019, a drug called Orkambi, which is for cystic fibrosis, priced pretty high, and cystic fibrosis patients in the UK protested to the government as well as some health groups. The then minister referred to Vertex, the patentee, as an extreme outlier in both pricing and behaviour, and referred to having a moral obligation to look at crown use. So that was in July 2019. In September that year, in the run-up to the election, the Labour Party published a document called Medicines for the Many, which advocated greater use of crown use provisions for purchasing of medicines, including Orkambi. And then the following month, when the Johnson government came in, Matt Hancock, the current Health Secretary, announced that they'd got a great value deal from Vertex. Now, you can put two and two together as to whether the threat of the then minister, coupled with the manifesto pledge of the opposition, succeeded in persuading Vertex to supply on reasonable terms, but I think it's pretty cut and dried. Let me just very, very briefly put up the scope of the Crown's emergency use powers under section 59. Pretty much anything they want to do, anything that appears necessary or expedient for supplies and services essential to the life or well-being of the community. But it doesn't stop there. It goes to promoting productivity and redirecting exports and imports to redress the balance of trade. So really quite extraordinary wide powers to disregard patents and designs in a case of an emergency. And something to bear in mind is that what we think of as the emergency is not the emergency. The pandemic is the trigger. The emergency, in my view, is the economic disaster which will follow. And that will cost more lives than the pandemic, I think. Normal Crown use, very briefly, enables the Crown to do almost anything that would be an infringement other than sell. So supply by the Crown is on a very tight rein, but sale for drugs and medicines is possible, though it requires the Crown to jump through the additional hoop of listing the medicines in a statutory instrument. And the purposes for which Crown use can be deployed include production or supply of drugs and medicines, primary NHS services, general practitioner and pharmaceutical services, and so on and so forth. What then about the COVID pandemic? Well, there's no doubt that this is an emergency, but the government has not declared it's an emergency within the terms of section 59. If it did so, there really would be no role for IP to play in the UK other than compensation. But even without declaring an emergency, the government could, if it wanted, authorise production, import or use of drugs together with the ancillary sales, and potentially, if it wanted to, sell drugs direct to the public too. What, of course, it doesn't have the possibility of doing is forcing companies to sell to the government. Crown use doesn't extend to that. Crown use also doesn't extend to copyright or confidential information. There's no way of compulsory transferring the technology from a company to a generics manufacturer if it's not already available. So if we're talking about repurposing existing medicines where there is a generic supplier, then the Crown is easily able to do that without any further steps in the UK. But if we're talking about creating new supplies, then Crown use, I don't think is going to help at all. We're back to the kind of measures discussed by Ken. People have a feeling in the back of their minds that all this must be banned by TRIPS somehow, but it isn't. Government use of patents is permitted under Article 31. Article 31 requires you first to make efforts to get authorization from the rights holder on reasonable terms, but that doesn't apply if you have an emergency, And it also doesn't apply in the case of public non-commercial use. And public non-commercial use is what our NHS does. Even the supply of drugs on prescription is not a commercial sale, according to the House of Lords in the Pfizer and Ministry of Health case. So pretty much all of our NH use is private non-commercial use. So there isn't even a requirement to make efforts to get prior authorization. What would using Crown use cost? Well, I think we have three circumstances to think about. Firstly, if any of the drugs and vaccines that the Johnson government has been boasting about developing come to pass and they've been funded by the UK government, then the government won't expect to pay anything for that. Section 58 requires you to take into account any funding from the UK government in developing invention. So that those institutions won't receive compensation, I would say. Secondly, if you have a non-practicing entity like a university, then compensation is on a willing licensee, willing licensor basis. And we've plenty of case law on that in the pharmaceutical field. That typically goes to royalties of the order of 30%. And then finally, if the rights owner is, or their exclusive licensee is a manufacturer, then under section 57A, which is untested as yet, the government has to pay, taking into account their lost profit and underuse of capacity. Now that could be pretty expensive. Whether Crown use on those terms is much cheaper than buying direct from the manufacturer is unclear, but it does at least give the government control rather than leaving control of supply to the original manufacturer stroke patentee. So even in that case, the control point might be worthwhile. In the interests of time, I will just briefly mention the fact that Australia last year passed what is quite literally a self-denying ordinance, subjecting their own Crown use provisions to a requirement for prior negotiation and ministerial authorization. And speaking as ex-civil servant, the latter, ministerial authorization, is an absolute no-no to the routine use of Crown use. Ministers don't do stuff that's controversial. So high risk now. The justification they used was that companies did not like being threatened with Crown use. But that is, of course, precisely the way we use Crown use provisions in this country. In almost every case, the threat of Crown use brings companies to negotiate realistic rates. And less than a year later, the shadow science minister was asking in Parliament how the government was deploying Crown use in the COVID epidemic. I think we probably don't have time in this talk to get into the US-UK trade negotiations, but let's just leave it as an issue on the table right now that our right to use Crown use is in question as a result of that. And I'll end there and pass back to Uma.
Thank you very much, David, for that. That was very fascinating discussion, not just of UK Crown use, but the fact that it's being used in other countries such as Australia. And I think Canada has been using it in relation to copyright and data. We've had quite a lot of questions on data marketing authorization and data exclusivity, etc. So just as you know, some people have other meetings and they're about to go. Let me just say that next week webinar will concentrate more away. I mean, we'll shift away from patent and we'll be looking at innovation and how that's responding to the current crisis. We'll be looking at contact tracing apps, data regulation, data privacy rules, also the roles of China and India in the global pharmaceutical supply chains, and quite an important issue that is coming up in some jurisdiction, 3D printing, especially of medical equipment, respiratory equipment, and PPE as well. And I think the registration link will be going up. For the several questions, can I just ask the panel to feel free to come in to answer? And one for David, since it was the last talk. which is very specifically on the fact that Crown use and compulsory licensing run into problems because it's very much geared towards intellectual property and not so much trade secrets, i.e. in the manufacturing process. So do you think there are practical ways to get trade secrets out so that you know, the compulsory licensing or Crown use can be effective?
I think that's the big question. I think there's a danger in undermining confidence in regulatory approval regimes by making exceptional use. As far as I'm aware, although our law of confidential information in this country has provisions for protection of the public interest, I'm not sure this readily fits into, I mean, that's typically concerned with whistleblower provisions where you're breaching confidence to reveal a wrong. I'm not sure that, I think we're in a new area if we're talking about overriding the law of confidence and the EU Trade Secrets Directive in the interests of public health, but I'll throw that open to colleagues.
Well, related to that as well is the fact that some of the a lot of the discussion on compulsory licenses relates to intellectual property. But what happens to data exclusivity, especially since you have two parallel tracks, IP and also marketing authorization? So one of the questions asks, well, you know, marketing authorization for a pharmaceutical is not regulated within the IP framework. What happens then? I mean, who gets the exclusivity of the data? Are we just going to say this is for the public good? Should we just declare it?
I'll have a go at this, Uma. I'll have a go. Of course, data protection, or sometimes called data exclusivity, is an intellectual property right by virtue of Article 39.3 of the TRIPS agreement. So it's a sui generis IP right and should be considered as such. Of course, it's been subject to great controversy in relation to compulsory licensing. It's a flexibility which exists in the TRIPS agreement. Unfortunately, some countries who have signed trade agreements, particularly with the United States, have signed away that flexibility by signing TRIPS plus agreements and introducing fixed periods of 5 years data exclusivity. And the US argues that usually there's a side letter appended to the trade agreement which says that in circumstances of a national health emergency, that data exclusivity won't apply. So a compulsory licensed product could be then given authorization because the generic product or the biosimilar could reference against the originator's data. So there's a piecemeal system depending on whether countries have kept this flexibility in TRIPS and not granted data exclusivity, or in circumstances where they've signed TRIPS plus agreements, there are still mechanisms in place, although untried so far.
So what's the situation in the EU then?
In the EU, we have data exclusivity, yeah. I just had a related point to make about this because we've seen initiatives, particularly in Latin America, in the COVID-19 response, in a bill before the Parliament in Brazil, and also the National Assembly in Ecuador, two bills before Parliament, both calling for access to undisclosed information, including test data, to be made available when products are required to combat COVID-19. So it's very much on the radar of national parliaments and the access to medicines movement.
Let me just throw in one other comment from a Crown Use perspective. Crown Use does not have any convoyed rights to use confidential information, but in the defence sector, we have a separate act called the Defence Contracts Act, which does grant precisely that right to override confidential information for defence purposes. And it seems to me very arguable that the same ought to apply in the medical field. Now, it's a big ask, but we're talking about an emergency of the scale of a war here.
There's a quick question to Peter as to whether your case study has been published. Is Peter gone?
No, I'm here, Uma.
Yeah, I think there's been 2 or 3 asking about the case study. And you said that you all were working on it or had worked on it.
I've worked on dimensions of that. We were looking at stockpiles, but I'm not aware of the case study, the overall case study having been written up, because it's a very long-running saga, because the Cochrane review demonstrated that the clinical trial data that the public should have had access to but was not given access to ultimately by Roche led to problems assessing the efficacy of oseltamivir, and that matter is now, I think, still under litigation. So I simply drew together the various things, but I'm not aware of anyone who's written up all of the dimensions of the case study. People have talked about the stockpiling, people have talked about the problems of data secrecy and so on, and the inability of Roche to scale quickly enough. But no one's written the whole thing up.
Yeah, because there's been another question just specifically on your case study asking, what do you suggest? I mean, do we have enough time to have this extra layer of reassurance that you suggest? Is impartiality too difficult? And hence, I suppose it's really one of the best practices to actually do it nationally.
Well, I think the thing that comes out of the Cochrane review is that the countries around the world essentially wasted their money on stockpiling. We're talking about billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer money that was invested in a drug that essentially did not meet the claims that Roche were making, and that's the Cochrane review is available. It was published in 2014. It's available for anybody to read on the website. They looked at 107 different clinical trials. They got the data from that. They did independent analysis of that data. So I think what this case study tells us is that whatever treatments come onto the market, if the public is going to trust that, we really need the highest standards of independent review, because this is really a case where you don't want the public to lose trust in the institution of medical science.
Sure. Ken, did you want to come in and add to that? Ken Shadlen.
Sorry, I wanted to add, if I could, to the previous conversation very quickly about compulsory licenses and trade secrets and other forms of know-how. And my point was simply that I don't think there's any way that you could possibly get the originator to share that stuff. And so I don't really think that we're ever going to be able to legislate to require the originator to share its know-how, its trade secrets. It's going to share what it wants to share, or it's not going to share. What the compulsory license basically says is we're gonna like make believe as if you're sharing without you asking. And we can do that usually in pharmaceuticals because we can reverse engineer. And I think that's actually one of the big points, that's the misleading point of using AIDS as the example, is that compulsory license in that period were based on drugs where we already knew how to make them because the Indian firms were already making them. Nobody had to share anything. But compulsory licensing, I'm very skeptical that compulsory licensing are going to ever be able to get the originator to share their know-how. And so that's actually why I think that compulsory licensing may not be the most efficient route to massive, rapid scaling up in this case.
Okay, thanks. Yeah?
Can I just come in on that point?
Sure. Yeah.
I think Ken's raised an incredibly important point relating to trade secrets, but there are some historical precedents. If you have a look at what was done in the US defense sector in the 1940s and 50s, when the US military signed contracts with aircraft manufacturers like Boeing and Lockheed, for example, it was a condition that, for example, in relation to the production of the B-40, the B-47 bomber, that Boeing send technical assistance and people to share trade secret data with Lockheed in order to enable the rapid manufacture of the B-47, because the Korean War was on at that particular time. So we actually have historical examples of where a dictator, as it were, in the system, or call it what you like, can actually mandate the sharing of trade secrets. So this is not impossible. You know, it can be done if the state really wants it done.
Let me just add one more point. I said that you don't get convoyed use of confidential information under Crown use. That's only half true, actually. There is an untested provision in relation to licensees that lets the Crown tell the licensee, okay, you've got some confidential know-how, now use that to supply us, and you're absolved from your contractual responsibilities. So that does exist. The trouble is, it's only going to work on a UK licensee, because if you tell a Brazilian licensee, that doesn't absolve them under Brazilian law. So, you know.
That's an excellent point. Now, I've been told to wrap it up. So thank you everyone thank you speakers. It's been amazing to hear all of you, to get all four of you in one space as well. Maybe we should have a longer lockdown period. And thank you, Duncan, for organizing this, and for all of you all. There are lots of questions. I hope we've answered most of them. All the questions about, and there's a huge bunch of questions about we're focusing too much on patterns. This was on patterns, this particular session. For the next two sessions, we are going to be shifting away to data, 3D printing and designs, and copyright, and then we'll have the third final one where we will go into trade secrets, etc. So with that, Duncan, do you want to add one line to thank?
No, not at all. Thank you for the excellent sharing, and to our co-speakers, and most of all, thank you to everyone for staying for the full session today. Much appreciated.
Yeah, and I'm so pleased to see so many students are still in IP, so we didn't make them go off it. Okay, bye everyone.
Goodbye. Thank
Bye.
you.